The sanction war between Europe and China reaches a new high. Beijing is now expanding its sanctions to UK citizens. Up to 15 Chinese embassies in Europe are now protesting against their host countries' governments, all over human rights issues in Xinjiang. A photo showcased by China's foreign ministry spokeswoman is found to be fake. She said it depicted 19th century black slaves in America picking cotton as evidence of U.S. hypocrisy, but the photo's real backstory says otherwise. Another step closer towards authoritarianism in Hong Kong. Now, a court rules simply talking about Hong Kong's protests could be considered a crime. And what's behind the Chinese Communist regime's increasing aggression lately? An expert argues the CCP believes the time has come to change the world order. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Beijing is imposing sanctions on 9 UK citizens, including 5 lawmakers. It comes in retaliation to UK sanctions over human rights abuses in China's Xinjiang region. NTD's Jane Werrell has more.
Among those sanctioned by Beijing is former Conservative leader Sir Ian Duncan Smith. The Chinese regime accused him and others of what it calls maliciously spreading lies and disinformation. In reaction, he says he'll wear it as a badge of honour. It comes days after the UK, together with the US, Canada and the EU, announced sanctions on Chinese officials and a construction company over human rights abuses of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang.
We will not be deterred from speaking up and taking action like this to hold those responsible for those human rights violations to account.
The Chinese regime sanctioned 9 individuals in the UK, politicians, scholars and human rights activists, and 4 organisations. They'll be barred from going to China and from having financial transactions with Chinese citizens and institutions. On the sanctions list is Baroness Kennedy, director of the International Bar Association's Institute of Human Rights, who we spoke to earlier.
I don't have a holiday home in China, and nor do I have interests in commercial enterprises in China. So for me personally, it will not have very real consequences. I'm basing my criticism of what is happening in this part of China on evidence, and it's my view that there are serious human rights abuses taking place, and indeed that they point towards a genocide in progress. Now, one of the things is that this is not about China or the Chinese people. This is about the Chinese government taking these steps. And so I would be doing exactly the same thing were it happening in any other country in the world. We have a duty under the Genocide Convention to protect people from genocide, and you don't wait until it's over. You have to act while you think it might be taking place.
Benedict Rogers, Vice Chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, one of the sanctioned organisations, says it's a symbolic reaction.
For me personally, this is simply a symbolic initiative, and it's really a badge of honour that I take as a recognition of my human rights work. I think the regime is reacting not because it has any credibility on its side, but because it doesn't like the truth being exposed and a light being shone on the human rights situation, and so it's lashing out in response to that.
The China Research Group, led by MPs Tom Tugendhat and Neil O'Brien, all of whom have been sanctioned, said in a statement, "It is telling that China now responds to even moderate criticism with sanctions rather than attempting to defend its actions in Hong Kong and Xinjiang." The other sanctioned peer, Lord David Alton, said, "British parliamentarians will go on speaking truth to power and truth to tyranny, using their freedoms and raising their voices on behalf of those who are denied such rights and privileges." Speaking to Times Radio, the Housing Minister, Robert Jenrick, said it's completely wrong for China to place these restrictions on members of our parliament. Boris Johnson said on Twitter that he firmly stands by those sanctioned. The Chinese embassy in the UK didn't immediately respond to our request for comment. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
The CCP is responding to recent EU sanctions over human rights issues in Xinjiang. Up to 15 Chinese embassies in Europe have strongly protested the move to their host countries' governments. These include Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Czech Republic, among others. That's according to a US-based Chinese-language news platform. The Chinese ambassador to Spain is asking the Spanish government to not act as what they call human rights teachers. China's foreign ministry is taking a public relations hit. That's after a top spokeswoman showcased a photo she said depicted American slaves picking cotton, supposedly taken in the 19th century. But the controversial photo is now revealed to be a fake. Spokeswoman Hua Chunying showcased the image at a press conference on Thursday. She described it as evidence of American slaves being forced to work in cotton fields and tried using it to blame the origins of forced labor practices on America, shifting the blame away from China and its human rights abuses in the Xinjiang region. But the photo actually has nothing to do with black slaves in the 19th century. The image was actually taken by American photographer Danny Leon in 1968 in Texas. The people seen in it were inmates at the Ferguson unit, a prison in Texas. Leon captured the image as part of a series of photos showing jail guards and prisoners. It was aimed at defending the rights of black people through showing their lives and work. The pictures have no connection to slavery. Sometimes, even those who show support for the regime in China can still be arrested. That's because they did so in a way authorities don't allow. One woman was recently stopped by police for holding an anti-H&M sign in public. The U.S.-based clothing retailer is still at the center of a Chinese boycott over a pro-Xinjiang statement it made more than a year ago. Protests against the brand have been spotted across the country. But even so, the police arrested her. The video of the incident triggered a heated discussion online. The people supporting the boycott see themselves as patriots who are doing their part to support Beijing, so they are questioning why authorities are stopping them. The Twitter comment posted alongside the video provides some explanation. It reads, quote, "Actually, the Chinese Communist regime is afraid of any kind of protesters taking to the streets, even those fools who are boycotting H&M." Despite the Chinese Communist regime's propaganda, a number of Chinese citizens aren't buying into Beijing's narrative about Xinjiang. Some of them are even taking a public stand and voicing their thoughts on social media. One of them writes, "I support the freedom to marry and have children in Xinjiang. I support the right for people to speak their own language and their right to practice their own culture, traditions, and beliefs that are closely related to their identity. If none of these are allowed, I support keeping families together and making sure they will never be separated." Another one posted a short yet powerful comment saying, "I support people in Xinjiang as human beings." The Chinese regime is urging people to boycott certain U.S. and European fashion brands. That's for raising concerns over forced labor in China's Xinjiang region. H&M, Nike, New Balance, Burberry, and Adidas are among those on the blacklist. Videos of burning and destroying the foreign branded products are going viral on social media. Amid the tensions, other Chinese companies have taken sides. More than 20 brands recently announced their support for using cotton produced in Xinjiang. Li Ning, a major Chinese sportswear and sports equipment brand, issued one such statement. It emphasized that Xinjiang is an important part of its supply chain. While another brand, Anta Sports, took another route, announcing its withdrawal from Europe-based organization the Better Cotton Initiative. Last year, the organization called forced labor in Xinjiang unacceptable. Facebook says it's put a stop to some Chinese hackers. They were reportedly targeting Uyghur activists living outside of China. In a Wednesday statement, the tech giant blamed the attacks on a group of hackers known as Earth Empusa or Evil Eye. The group has been spying on Uyghur journalists, activists, and dissidents living in countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and Turkey. Facebook shared its findings with industry peers. That's to help them detect and stop this activity. What's behind the Chinese regime's recent amped-up aggression? From rowdy diplomats to sanctions against global lawmakers, the regime is taking new action and fast. An expert argues that the CCP believes time is ripe for it to change the world order, and it's pretty confident it can do it. NTD's Penny Zhou has the details.
Chinese diplomats are getting increasingly aggressive lately, in some cases calling Western scholars and officials mad dogs. The regime is also sanctioning Western lawmakers who speak out against the Chinese Communist Party's human rights. Years ago, Beijing was known for its smile diplomacy. So what happened to the smiles? China Affairs commentator Tang Jingyuan says the CCP spent decades working to intertwine its economy with the West. That way, if the West ever decided to cut China off, they would also suffer themselves. Tang says the CCP now believes the time is ripe to end its low-profile approach and reveal its true motive.
Xi Jinping believes that the totalitarian system represented by the CCP is on the rise, while the democratic and free system represented by the United States is in a period of decline. He thinks that sooner or later the CCP will overtake the U.S. and take over the position of the U.S. He thinks it's a historical trend. This has formed the theoretical basis for Xi Jinping's foreign policy.
Communist Party leader Xi Jinping seems to think the West is too economically dependent on China to really confront the regime. That's why his wolf warrior diplomats are now testing the West's limits to measure their response.
If he is able to subdue many democratic and free countries by openly buying them up with benefits, he will consider it a victory for the ideological totalitarianism, dictatorship, and tyranny of the CCP.
And if a confrontation does happen, Tang says the CCP believes it can better tolerate the cost of it than the West. He explains that in democratic countries, when the economy suffers, people may protest and vote out the leaders. But in China, the majority of people don't really have a say.
In fact, it is always the vast majority of the people who are suppressed by the CCP who suffer. But the CCP's own privileges are not affected. The CCP actually has a very clear idea, a calculation. They think that because there are more than 1 billion people in China, there is such a huge crowd that can support the regime, to feed it. So that if it really has a decoupling with the West, if economic crisis happens, such a huge base of people can support the regime from falling. But the West, the opponent, will fall first.
He noted that once the CCP is able to endure the full consequences of U.S. conflict, it will be able to gain control of the world order and mold it to its liking. Tang advises the West to cut dependence on the regime, even if it causes suffering in the short term.
This is like cancer. The earlier you go to remove the tumor, although it's painful, you will suffer losses, but you will avoid life-threatening danger. However, if you continue to delay and be weak, if you continue to let the CCP infiltrate, it will be like cancer cells constantly spreading that eventually may threaten your life.
Penny Zhou, NTD News.
In his first press conference since taking office, President Biden said the U.S. seeks competition with China, not confrontation, but added the White House will hold China accountable.
That we're not looking for confrontation, although we know there will be steep competition.
President Biden on Thursday likened CCP leader Xi Jinping to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Doesn't have a Democratic with a small d bone in his body, but he's a smart guy. He's one of the guys like Putin who thinks that autocracy is the wave of the future. Democracy can't function in an ever complex world.
Biden said he spoke with Xi for 2 hours after taking office.
I pointed out to him no leader can be sustained in his position or her position unless they represent the values of the country. And I said, Mr. President, as I've told you before, Americans value the notion of freedom. America values human rights. We don't always live up to our expectations, but there's a value system. We are founded on that principle. And as long as you and your country continues to so blatantly violate human rights, we are going to continue in an unrelenting way to call to the attention of the world and make it clear what's happening.
He stressed that competition with China would require investment in key areas.
The industries of the future, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, and we're going to make real investments. China is out investing us by a long shot because their plan is to own that future.
Hong Kong is yet another step closer towards authoritarianism. Now, simply talking about Hong Kong's protests could be considered a crime. A Hong Kong court ruled on Thursday that those who encouraged what they call unlawful demonstrations could face criminal charges. It doesn't matter whether they were physically there. According to local news website Stand News, those who helped in organizing, funding, or promoting unauthorized protests can now be charged as an accessory. That also includes those who give backup supplies, keep a lookout for incoming authorities, and drive protesters out to avoid arrest. The new ruling is an extension of a 2019 law. Hong Kong police used the Public Order Ordinance to target hundreds of protesters back in 2019. As of January this year, South China Morning Post reports nearly 2,500 of the protesters have been charged. Amid increasing chatter of war between Taiwan and Communist China, the democratic island has begun mass production of long-range missiles. It will have highly extended range and the capability to make precision strikes on Chinese targets. According to Taiwan's latest defense report, Beijing is, quote, posing increasing hostility and threats, further escalating the risk of accidents and clashes. Beijing has repeatedly flown warplanes into Taiwan's airspace in apparent acts of military aggression. On Friday, the island reported the largest ever incursion. A record-breaking 20 Chinese military jets entered Taiwan's air defense zone. On Thursday, a senior Taiwanese official said that one model of long-range missile has already entered production. Meanwhile, 3 others are currently in development. No details were given on the range of the missiles. How many people really died from the CCP virus in Wuhan? More than one source suggests that the real number is likely to be higher than the official one from the Chinese regime. NTD's Becky Zhou has the details.
Photos posted on social media show many Wuhan residents are visiting graveyards.
I hit the road 1 week in advance, and yet I am stuck in traffic. I have never seen so many people visiting graveyards before.
Some interviewees asked to remain nameless to avoid retaliation from Chinese authorities.
The number of tombs in the city is incredibly large. They were rarely seen before, but now there are so many. I was there.
While China's real pandemic death toll is still unknown, a former lawyer says the facts speak for themselves.
If a lot more people are visiting the graveyards this year, then we know what happened. The most dramatic thing that happened last year, or since December 2019, was the pandemic.
A new study from medical journal Lancet sheds light on the situation. 7% of the population contracted the CCP virus last April. Of those, 82% showed no symptoms. That means out of a population of 11 million, about 760,000 people caught the virus. This number far exceeds the regime's official figures published at that time. They reported only around 50,000 cases in the city and less than 70,000 in all of Hubei province. Videos on YouTube and TikTok captured last year also revealed long lines outside funeral homes. Radio Free Asia reported funeral homes handed out at least over 40,000 boxes of remains to family members of the dead last year, but the authorities said only over 2,000 people died. Many Chinese people will remember the deceased in the next 2 weeks. Reporting by Becky Zhou, NTD News.
Chinese smartphone maker Xiaomi is reportedly planning to make electric cars now. They are partnering up with a Chinese auto company.
Another tech firm has joined the race to make electric vehicles. This time it's Chinese smartphone maker Xiaomi. Sources told Reuters that Xiaomi plans to make the cars using Great Wall's factory in China. Great Wall is also said to be providing engineering consultancy to speed up the project, with Xiaomi aiming to launch its first EV by 2023. News of the potential tie-up sent shares in both companies up as much as 9% and 15% respectively. Xiaomi has been looking to diversify its revenue streams from the smartphone business. It accounts for the bulk of its income but carries razor-thin profit margins. The company has also been hampered by the global chip shortage. Xiaomi joins a number of tech companies trying to leap into the car industry. Both Huawei and Apple are reported to be planning electric vehicles, with Apple potentially launching its offering as soon as 2024.
The Trump administration banned U.S. investors from owning the company's shares. It cited Xiaomi's ties to the Chinese military as the reason. Xiaomi launched a lawsuit against some of President Biden's cabinet members in January. Later, a U.S. court suspended Xiaomi's inclusion on the investment blacklist. A telecom expert and CEO is sounding the alarm over what he says has become an existential threat. He's talking about China's infiltration of wireless equipment in the West, and says it's already 5 minutes past midnight on the doomsday clock. NTD's Don Ma has more.
It's already 5 minutes past midnight. The West is going to lose. The Communist Party of China is going to win.
The warning comes from wireless industry veteran Declan Ganley. He says major Western telecom giants are shaping their networks under China's direction, and called out big names like AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, Deutsche Telekom, and Vodafone. He says the Chinese regime influenced them indirectly by making them dependent on Chinese financing. And once the companies rely on China, they're more likely to campaign to their governments on the regime's behalf.
So the Chinese use those mobile carriers, if you like, as kind of lobbying Trojan horses in order to get the Chinese equipment installed and deployed into these economies, whereas it's these carriers that are actually doing, so much of the lobbying and hard work for them to kick the door in and get them in.
Ganley explained this kind of lobbying has shown up several times in the West. One example comes from Germany and deals with Chinese telecom giant Huawei. Even before the German government allowed Huawei 5G equipment to be used in the country, Deutsche Telekom was already deploying it.
Deutsche Telekom was deploying it anyway. And they did it because they were confident enough, supremely confident, that they would get their way. And the only way that companies of that size have that degree of confidence is because they know that ultimately they can get the regulatory state to do their bidding. Otherwise, they wouldn't take the risks of deploying all that Chinese 5G technology before the government had officially made its decision. In other words, Deutsche Telekom made the decision for Germany and just made sure that the state followed through and ratified that decision by formalizing it after the fact.
Ganley says none of these companies want to upset Chinese leader Xi Jinping and risk being denied access to the Chinese market. He points out that the submissive attitude towards China is not acceptable, especially as the regime continues to ramp up aggression.
And you know what? If these companies want to sell their souls in order to get access to the Chinese market, that's up to them. But we certainly should not be allowing them to shape our policies in Western countries in a way that is benefiting the plans of the Communist Party of China. And that's what is happening. And it is doing so much damage to the West's positioning in technology, in communications, in artificial intelligence, that if it is not reversed really quickly, we are going to lose. The West is going to lose. The Communist Party of China is going to win.
He says the regime does not want a middle ground or a mutual coexistence.
Look at Hong Kong. Look at the Uyghurs. We don't have to speculate about what they are going to do. We already know. So we have to tackle this now. It's already 5 minutes past midnight. There is no more time for...
Declan Ganley's built businesses across the European Union, Russia, and the United States. He is currently the CEO of US-based telecom company Rivada Networks. Don Ma, NTD News.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you next time.